Is climate mayhem? I'm glad you asked. One day, Ty Wolf Jones and I were talking about some of the biggest, hairiest problems on Earth and came up with a hypothesis we wanted to test. If you believe in climate change, the only way we'll get past these massive environmental problems is if for-profit companies get involved.
In other words, we've spent hundreds of years getting into this mess. We'll need to spend billions, maybe trillions getting out of it. Therefore, companies need to make money in order for someone to spend it.
Then we asked, can we speak with a dozen or so companies in different verticals of climate tech who are making it part of their mission to be climate conscious and making big bucks while doing it? Well, we did just that.
Thus, Climate Mayhem was born. So follow Jacob Kubica and I along as we listen to some incredible stories to test this hypothesis. Oh, and are you an entrepreneur about to get into this space? You will definitely learn something from these extremely impressive founders and operators of just how possible it is to take on a seemingly impossible task. Mayhem on, Jacob.
Mayhem on, Ty. Grant Canary is founder and CEO of Droneseed, which reforests after wildfires using heavy lift drone swarms. Yes, swarms of machines in the air. Grant has focused his entire career on sustainability, including working for the U.S. Green Building Council when it was young, is a Malago Foundation Fellow, and a grist list of 50 fixers. You should definitely Google that one. It is harder
Jacob, I'm going to go ahead and jump in here because Grant is a cool guy, and Droneseed not only does have one of the coolest names out there, and they do amazing things, flying drones around, planting seeds. They have a huge army of people helping plant those seeds as well. But they also, for me, the thing that excites me about this episode is I finally connected the dots about what is a true carbon offset. We've all heard about these big companies buying carbon offsets, Spotify buying carbon. What does it mean? What are they actually buying? Well, listen up, because on this episode, Grant is going to connect the dots for you too. Droneseed is a cool company.
No doubt. And we dive deep into what's a Maggot entrepreneur? How is carbon recapture on a small scale only a feel-good product? And finally, how is the average tree planter a superhero? Stay tuned. Enjoy. Grant, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Hello. My pleasure.
It's an honor to have you. Ty mentioned he had actually been following your company for the past 4 or 5 years. Is that right, Ty?
Oh, yeah. I've been obsessed with what Droneseed's doing here in the Seattle area. Just curious. I don't get it all, and hopefully we'll get to dig into some of that. But I've been super infatuated with what you guys have been doing and following the progress a bit.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I thought we'd start off with a little bit of a past life. Grant, what's a Maggot entrepreneur, and how are you one of these?
Well, so a maggot entrepreneur, very non-traditionally, I started a company cultivating maggots.
Okay.
For some people, that's awful. That sounds like a terrible line of work. But for me, that was the ability to take food waste and feed it to insects and turn it into protein. Now, I'm not in favor, not bullish. We'll say not bullish on protein from insects for humans. A lot of people do that, but where I'm very bullish is on protein for industrial fish feed specifically. And that's because we've been overfishing, not just at the higher rungs of the food chain, but with the smallest species, which get ground up and turned into fish meal, which then goes into a feed for farm fish. And we're going to expand fish, which is one of the most efficient forms of converting protein other than plants. Then we're going to need a more sustainable food source for them, and they need protein. And so by taking food waste, we can cultivate those insects. Fish already eat insects. That's why fly fishing exists. And then be able to do an industrial level protein. And also we waste a lot of food for good and bad reasons each and every year in the supply chain. And so that was my first company I spent 9 years of life on, and built it out of Bogota, Colombia. And it was acquired. And a lot of the companies that you see today, insect There's a couple agri-protein. We're accessing a lot of the research I'd compiled on my blog for public consumption to basically get that space started. And so after acquisition, built a 6,000 square foot pilot facility, 60,000 square foot after that, and they're still going strong today. So excited about that.
Dang. And why Bogota, of all places?
I was following my master's thesis and had been a part of a very large JP Morgan England project. They, as the Kyoto Protocol, they wanted a large source of carbon offsets. There had been a 20-year pilot project called Las Gaviotas, which is a United Nations recognized project. And so was part of a consulting team to figure out how much would it cost to do something like a Denali National Park in the northeast of Colombia, scaling up this existing project that existed there. And that required a lot of people, about 20,000 people, and that meant a lot of infrastructure to support them. And so one of the technologies, well, what do we do with all the food waste? Well, and that's where I started getting interested there. So I turned that into my master's thesis. And one of the reasons that I did it in Bogota was I didn't want to go into deep student debt. I wanted to go abroad. And I didn't have a lot of capital. So being able to fund a master's thesis abroad was a lot more capital efficient, allowed me to create a pilot facility, hire 4 research teams, bring equipment in from Vietnam, etc., on less than what most people would pay for, a used car.
Wow.
Very smart.
Nice.
Very smart.
So I have to ask real quick, it was maggots, not mealworms? I've heard in like the insect protein world of mealworms a lot more, but this wasn't mealworms.
This was not mealworms. This was Hermetia illucens, which is commonly called black soldier fly. And one of the things that is awesome about them is they are incredibly difficult to kill. So you can see some of they're if you watch any of the CSIs, they're the ones that show up on cadavers 30 days later, not the first ones to show up. And there's some phenomenal time lapse of them eating fish and hamburgers and other things. They are able to sense what is live and dead flesh and focus on that. So anyway, they're phenomenally interesting. I mean, they're still used today by people for burn victims, gunshot wounds, etc. You could actually go to a medical treatment facility today. This sounds like a horror movie. I'm not sure if this is where you guys want to start, but
this is good.
It's they will consume the dead flesh while leaving the live flesh if you have a burn or a gunshot or something that's been festering. They were used in the Civil War. They're still used today.
Amazing.
They're great.
All right.
Yeah.
I love it.
So, and unlike crickets or other things, crickets are incredibly difficult, need a whole lot of space. If you mess up the space requirements, they turn into locusts and eat each other. They require an immense amount of heat and other things. So not bullish on crickets. There are other species beyond Hermetia illucens that are, completely functional, but that's one that I think has some significant advantages.
Black soldier flies, that's what you call them, right?
Yep.
So I don't know if that's what I had at my house, but I've been trying to learn how to compost over here. And it was a hot summer over here, and I'd noticed all the flies hanging around my compost. And about a week later, I found so many maggots at the bottom of my compost bin. It became this huge project over 3 hours of how do we get rid of these maggots? They were so hard. I was doing hot water with salt. I didn't do the fire thing. I should on fire. And we tried so many different things. We ended up rolling this over to my girlfriend's mom's house and just leaving it there. We couldn't. We didn't know what to do. Yeah.
Amazing.
Resilient little creatures. Okay. All right. Very cool. And Grant? What's a tree machine gun? Heard about this?
Yeah, well, so tree machine gun. So this is one of the things that I like to point out as far as good product development. So when we got started as Droneseed, we very much went into the community and asked a lot of people, anyone I could find in my network in forestry, what's been done in the space with technology, what's been tried, what has not worked, what are your pain points, etc. This is all covered in Lean Startup or any of the other books on product management. And so I got some stories about in the 1970s dropping trees out of the back of C-17s, or there was a tree machine gun which the idea, I guess, was to shoot trees into the ground. The purpose here being that, like, when a tree is more precision located, it's in a microsite, as the industry term, or a place that is better soil, has more shade, so the soil stays moister. A good example of a microsite is like a stump. Next to a stump, there's a whole bunch of dead, decaying roots that leave the soil open for new roots to come in. Usually, if it's right next to the stump, it gives a little bit of shade during the day, etc. So somebody had tried a tree machine gun, but there's a lot of literature out there now, not in the 70s, that just dropping a tree off the back of a truck a couple of feet can be detrimental to the tree's long-term survival or establishment. Maybe in years 1 to 3, maybe in later years, depends on the species, etc. And so tree machine gun, like, understood the like direction they were trying to go, more precision, but they didn't have that research at that time of the Nokia phone dropper, but for trees. Yeah. So they hadn't gone through that practice, but this is just very much an example of like, how do we learn from what the community's already tried and then build on that? And what we learned was one of the big challenges is terrain for replanting, and tree planters carrying 40 pounds of 1 to 2 year old trees in bags on their hips. They go planting up a mountain, then they got to go walk back and then reload and fill back up and then go plant up again, etc. And the drones had a significant advantage in that they fly, and navigating that terrain is something that's much easier. And then the ability to do that with more precision than a C-17, than a helicopter or a plane, etc., would be something that the community was interested in. So that's where we got started.
But I have to ask, like, was it actually like a gun-shaped thing that shot these things out? Like, what does this thing look like?
You're going to have Matthew Guy, our head of biological R&D, because apparently he has seen it. I have not seen it. Okay. And so he's met with some old timers in the sense that we love to get some of the input about what's been tried, and then also some of the data that's been collected from people measuring tree growth and climate and things like that. Those logs are incredibly useful in some cases, and because it takes so much time to acquire data in forestry, because it takes a long time for trees to grow if they're temperate conifers. So
still imagining a gun-like shaped thing shooting out little saplings. I don't know how it works, but it's such a great visual.
I imagine Sylvester Stallone, like Rambo's. Like these are the employees. They got tank tops, and they got these amazing huge guns. That's, maybe we'll find some images online. And
well, where I can take us with that is to say kind of where we evolved was similarly. We started out looking at like, great, well, let's look at paintball and see if there's something we can shoot seeds and do that in a more precision way. We evolved from that, and now we drop a seed vessel in which the seed is already embedded. So it's already in like a hockey puck size type of vessel, and I'm going to be a little cagey about how I describe the vessel for intellectual property reasons, but it's an organic natural fiber, and what it does is it allows the seed to have access to water because it soaks up that moisture, and then it also has some deterrent. Super spicy pepper is one of the ones that we've explained. It's the same stuff that's in bear mace, capsaicin, or the same kind of origin as if you're a YouTube video watcher and you like watching people eat super spicy stuff, Carolina Reapers and ghost peppers and things like that. Very high Scoville count, which is the scientific measure of spiciness. So squirrels, mice, goal there is deter them in the same way that deters people from picking up a taco and being like, great, well, this has a whole ghost pepper on it.
Fair. I like it.
Grant, when did you start thinking about climate action, climate change? I saw your whole career has been in sustainability. Were you thinking about this at a young age?
Yes. I had an English teacher help me sort of figure out where what I wanted to spend time on. And it wasn't a direct like, well, let's just sit down and like figure out what you want to do with your life. It was much more of like a exposure to value systems and other pieces of philosophy. And I guess what I came to the conclusion on was, what's the like highest order of magnitude problem I could throw myself at? And to me, that became, like I had somebody else that later on in life helped me sort of put that into words, but like, climate change is the problem all of the problems report to. And which is the reason being is, and I'm sure I've already tripped up somebody who's like, well, what about this? And what about this? And it's systemic and they're all interrelated. Well, yes, and all of the other problems that people could be spending on time on that we could all agree from a fundamental human perspective they should be spending on time, that has to do with medical or has to do with rights, etc.
Mm-hmm.
If people are in a Dust Bowl scenario, or take it out of the European example of like Great Hunger in China, if they're in a first order needs of where do I get food, how do I protect my family, they're not working on those medical problems, they're not working on rights, etc. And that is really what climate change is taking us in that direction, is putting extreme stress on the political, the social, the economic structures in which we all rely on to do the good work. So the highest order of magnitude is to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. The thing that like really resonates or hit home for me is that like prior generations have lived through like what used to be we used to feel like more of a resolved problem of like, oh yeah, we lived through the Soviet missile crisis, we lived through like the threat of nuclear annihilation, like we'll get through it. And I guess what I would say is like the bombs have already landed with climate change. So it's not a like, oh, well, we'll avoid it. It's a, no, it already happened. But like the effects will be felt over the next 50 years and next 100 years. And so that to me is like an incredibly, this distinguishes us from prior generations that have gone through those challenges and those struggles, whether it was World War II or whether it was a Cold War, or whether it was the Korean War, etc., into a place of like, no, the bad thing already happened. And it's continuing to happen. The bombs are continuing to land, if you will. And that is something that's a climate sort of doomism. What I want to do is spend all of my time trying to figure out how to build the brightest possible future given those circumstances. And that's something that I want to speak to, in this conversation.
Love it. Well, that does bring me to the next piece. So typically here we start to dig into maybe like the start of the company, but I felt a little bit like with this particular subject, we had to go back another layer, which is I realized I didn't understand, I guess, the business of reforestation without, for lack of a better term. I didn't understand, and I never really thought about it. Like we have forest fires or we have some natural catastrophe, and then something does have to happen for us to like get that forest back. Who does that? What does this business look like, if I can say it that way? I know it's oversimplifying, but can you talk to us a little bit about the history of the business of reforestation, at least in our country, at least here in the United States?
Yeah, happy to. Let's go there. The history is we generally relied on nature, and forest burns, forest regrows. It was like what most people, myself included, were taught in high school biology, and that's fire is part of the natural ecology, and what's this whole industry that has to regenerate forests? Like, no, the forest will take care of it itself. Well, where we're at today is that's increasingly becoming less and less the case due to the size and severity of wildfires. So I'm kind of going straight to the ending here. There's a little bit more history of how we got here. But the net effect is that it used to be like 90% of the time forest burns for forest regrows. That's with a low severity fire. A low severity fire, it is not destroying, it's not burning up or consuming the seed that's stored in the soil. It's not burning all the way up to the top of the tree where a lot of those cones are for temperate conifers. It's sort of coming across the landscape like a creme brulee, and it sort of burns the top of the soil, but most of the stuff below is fine. And it sort of burns the big bushy bits in the middle, but the tops of the trees are fine. And that's where the trees evolved to have a lot of the cones then became seed rain that become the next forest. When you have a high severity fire that goes through, those big, dark, black clouds are a lot of the organic topsoil that's burning up in the fire, in addition to other biomass. And that includes the seeds that are stored in the soil. And it also is going all the way up to the top of the tree. So it sort of looks like one of those Looney Tunes trees struck by lightning. It's all of a sudden like, there's no greenery up top there with a couple of cones that'll rain down seed. It's just completely consumed. And so then you take it and it's like, well, it's no longer a 10,000 acre fire, which was kind of the history from the last used to be that there was like 10,000 acre fires and the industry had 10 years to respond to them. Well, now it's obviously no longer the case. That was back in the 80s, 70s. Now it's no longer the case, and the industry is trying to respond to multiple 100,000 acre plus or million acre fire in Alaska this year, complexes.
Right. Wow.
So it's much larger for that seed to now have to travel. Well, what comes in place of that, if there's not a lot of existing seed, it's either invasive species, which are very good at propagating. Think blackberry bushes, think Himalayan blackberry bushes to clarify, Scotch broom, that's sort of this yellow flowering thing. There's a number of other species, but those are more likely to burn because they're not adapted to long drying cycles. They're more of a spray and pray and hope they survive. And so they help start the next forest fire. So that's kind of where we find ourselves in. And we're seeing, instead of 90% natural regen rates, we're seeing it drop to 60%, 40%, depending upon the species in the ecosystem. And so this industry that used to exist, that was primarily to reforest after logging, all of a sudden has been completely overwhelmed by wildfire. And nature isn't regenerating as much as it used to. And our supply chain isn't regenerating as much as it's used to. And we've got gigatons of carbon stored in these forests, and increasingly they're burning at greater and greater extents. That's the situation we're in. Just to put a number on it, like the 10-year rolling average on what used to burn in 82 to 92 was around 2.5 million acres. Fast forward to today, we're at about 7.5 million acres is the 10-year average. So it's not like a cherry pick. It's very much like the average is increasing. That's a rolling average. That's that 5 million acres, about the size of New Jersey. Or to put it in a forestry context, it's our estimation that's about 5 warehouses worth of reforestation. And warehouses, the biggest in timber in the United States by several orders of magnitude, by about 5 probably. So that's
size of New Jersey?
Yeah.
5?
That 5 million acre increase. Yeah. We had to figure out, I mean, swimming pools is not, we avoided the swimming pools here. It was like, how do we put this into a context that people can understand?
That's very clear to me. I think for the audience too, imagining a place as big as that state, over 10 years, and that is increasing in speed too. Wow.
Yeah. So, and then prior to that, I mean, I kind of skipped to the answer here on where we're at in present. Previously, like where the industry evolved, and we know this because we acquired Silvaseed, which is a 130-year-old company that sources seed from the wild. It's called Woods Run, and utilizes that. We utilize that for our carbon offset projects. But the sort of history of the industry was that there were these very large fires that happen from time to time. They're part of the fire ecology. Different regions, it's a 50-year or century-long cadence. In other regions, it's 500 plus years. But the communities that were impacted by those fires were like, whoa, we have to do something. And they started out with seed, and then they realized that they could get advantages out of utilizing seedlings grown in nurseries. So the government promoted that and built nurseries. So then there was and then learned, orchards have this advantage in that for timber, we can get trees to grow faster, taller, straighter. Well, now we're starting to veer away from that in the sense that orchard seed is not as climate resilient because it's a much lower genetic band. It was bred through old school breeding to be those species that are only the ones that grow the fastest, the tallest, the straightest. Right. Well, that leaves you a lot more susceptible, a lot less genetic diversity to respond to freezing, insects, drought, etc. Right. And so now we're starting to see a return back to a Woods Run or seed collected from the wild is an advantage in its genetic diversity. And that's what Silvaseed does, and that's what Droneseed puts into its seed vessels. And we get way deeper into that with seed zones. We get asked a lot, like, is the seed native? Like, there's a big concern there. And it's like, it's native. It's so much more than that. Like
more.
Yeah. We have to have the maximum viability for the project over the long term. We try to utilize seed from a seed zone that is as close to a fire as possible. So the U.S. Forest Service in the first in the 20s, then in the 70s, they updated them. They created all these seed zones. They're about the size of counties, but they're not a political line. They're a ecological line. So like, is the seed zone sort of an eastern facing mountain range? It's western. And the reason for this is
interesting.
transplanting Doug fir from like Washington to California would not be a good idea. Doug fir is native to both states, but
Right.
Washington, it's going to have that those genes will have evolved very differently for more of a northern climate than California, which is a much drier climate. Or you can think about from like inland or from the coast to inland, like, or vice versa. Like if you take something from a high elevation around Mount Shasta and then you move it to the coast, that seed, those
Totally
genes are
different.
designed for high elevation and low oxygen in the atmosphere. They're not designed for more salt in the water and in the soil. So
Wow.
yeah.
But what I also heard was you said it started at this like community level. It sounds like it's gone to a government. So I just have never thought about it. But when you say, okay, we're going to take these seeds and move them all over or put them in these, is this the U.S. government doing it? Is it the state government? What happens if like a neighborhood or a town burns down? Like who reforests that, or who pays? I guess what I'm saying. Who pays those workers out there putting these seeds in ground these days?
It's the land manager or the landowner. I make that distinction because not everybody who's responsible for that land is directly owning it. State agencies, for example, who manage the land largely to pay for, at least on the West Coast, largely to pay for schools and other aspects of the state budget.
Right.
So who are the land managers? Small family forests. Those are some of the folks that we work with. A lot of, trees grow, they're inflation resistant, they pay for colleges, they pay for retirement, they can be cut sustainably. Small family forests, timber companies. We work with 3 of the 5 largest tribal nations, some of the largest generators of carbon offsets in the California market, and then nonprofits like Nature Conservancy, who hold vast expanses of land for conservation. Yet that land goes through fire. So those are the land managers, and the customer journey here is. A lot of areas, we work primarily west of Colorado into Canada. A lot of the customer journey is, my forest is burned, where do I get seed first and foremost? And a lot of the areas where mills have shut down and timber is no longer viable because most of the mills shut down because of offshoring of jobs overseas or environmental policies, otherwise, there's not been an investment in seed, and so there's not really collected seed available. And orchards are only expensive to run and operate, so they're not necessarily there and accessible anymore. So what we've been able to do is with land managers in any of those types, but specifically in those areas where mills and logging aren't able to happen, we're able to help customers organize and collect seed. And seed for temperate conifers is a little difficult because they only mast or provide plentiful viable seed like every 7 years, not every year, like corn, wheat, and other things. So you have to organize these collections, go out there, and there's a couple different methods to collect, but we organize those collections, get the seed in, process it at Silvaseed, and then the next step is, well, great, I want to deploy it on the land, and I got to figure out what I'm deploying. So that's where we use the drones, deploying seed vessels. And then we also, at the same time, start the seed in the nursery at Silvaseed. We grow millions of seedlings. And then we deploy we deploy the drones out, and then 8 months to a year later, we come back with the seedlings and plant them. And then the last piece is, how do we pay for it all? And that's where carbon offsets come in. Because if you're planning on timber revenues to pay for the reforestation and your tree's just burned up, you can try and salvage and send it to, again, a mill. But if it's not within an ecological transport or distance, or economical transport distance, like, it's not going to happen. And also there's a lot of other people who will send it to like low value, like that wood's not as high a quality anymore. So where's that money going to come from? And that's where the reforestation offsets come in. Got it.
Yeah, it's great that you were going there, because I was trying to figure out. Yeah, so you've got these small land management groups that are obviously concerned with this. How do they pay for it? And then you mentioned carbon offsets, because I will admit, doing some research, I've heard about carbon offsets for years, and I've never really understood. Like these big tech companies, they'll make a big deal out of it. We're buying all these carbon offsets, and it's like, well, great, that sounds amazing. what is a carbon offset? Like, where is it? And when I was reading through Droneseed's site and the things that you guys do, suddenly it clicked for me. And I was like, wait a second, planting a tree sounds like a carbon offset. That sounds like actually something that offsets carbon. And, you know, maybe I'm oversimplifying it again, but for the first time ever, I felt like I get what people could actually buy. They could actually buy someone like pay Droneseed to plant a tree, and to me, that's saying I'm carbon off. Is that oversimplifying it? Am I anywhere near the right place there?
No, you've got it right. American Canopy covered this, and you could plant a tree in a bucket, and you can do a mass balance, and the tree over time captures. You can measure everything you put into it: soil, water, etc., etc. The carbon is coming out of the atmosphere, and those trees, they weigh a lot if you about picking up a tree. So that is carbon that has been absorbed and built into the tree. So that turns into tonnages over acres, and different species capture carbon at different rates. The math as a timber company would use. They look at it and they're like, great, here's ponderosa pine, here's this other species. What's the difference in how many 2x4s I'm going to get out of this acre over the next 25 to 40 years? And you could do the same instead of 2x4s or board feet per acre. You can say, how many tons of carbon is that equivalent to?
Yeah.
And so that's what the trees are doing. Now, offsets themselves, there's a whole bunch of different flavors. Our offsets are reforestation offsets.
Got it.
Meaning that people are paid to plant trees. And those trees over the next 100 years will capture significant tonnages. And they're planted. We focus exclusively on post-wildfire reforestation for cost reasons. All of the competitive vegetation at that site is gone. And so that is much less expensive to reforest than a site that has 10-foot tall blackberry bushes. And so on that basis, we don't have to like get rid of those blackberry bushes with earth moving equipment. Not great for the, not as great as far as like you're disturbing the soil, et cetera, et cetera. That's carbon emissions. Don't have to reburn it, which is expensive and has risks. And you don't have to spray it, which is also like it's a way to eradicate the foliage. However, it has its own effects if it's done wrong. So that's the fire has already come through. Get out there, apply that native seed across the landscape, come back with seedlings and reforest those areas. And that's how we get around, that's how we manage or mitigate the problems of nature doing less and less reforestation. Now, then the next piece is like, well, great. Well, that sounds like it's going to require a lot of seed, a lot of greenhouses, and that's and a lot of people, and that it's going to take a lot of money. Where's that money come from? The vast majority of offsets that you or I have encountered in the past have been coming from, in the nature-based sector, protecting existing stands of trees, which is good. We want to plant. People are very, very defensive of their national parks, and they should be. And protecting trees and providing private incentives to do so is good. Where that's come under fire of late is well, you're making a promise that you weren't going to cut down these trees, and sometimes the financial incentives drive people to sort of make those promises or provide it when like it was questionable they were ever going to cut down those trees, and so that starts to change people's like take on that. And for us, where we look at it is we're like, well, the trees are already gone. We need funding to get more trees back. And then what does that look like? So what our offset projects look like is we work with, and I'll borrow from my background here with U.S. Green Building Council, very similar to U.S. Green Building Council, which certifies buildings as more sustainable by following very strict criteria. There's a couple methodologies out there, Vera, Gold Standard, and Climate Action Reserve. Climate Action Reserve is what we use. It's very, it's one of the top three here, and it's very built into the U.S. System of which trees it's looking at, etc. And what we do under a project is we put a conservation easement on the property, which increases significantly the amount of tons that the Climate Action Reserve will allow for the property. So that is, and then there's 100 years of funded monitoring that's done by nationally accredited land trusts that gets a big chunk of capital just like a university endowment, it puts that capital and pools it with other project capital into the market. It returns, 7, 10%, some percentage each year, which pays for the annual site report and the site visits every 5 years for the next 100 years. So that's the long term. How do we fund monitoring for the next 100 years? And then there's a couple of other assurance mechanisms for buyers of these offsets. And we could talk a little bit about why companies buy offsets. I'm happy to come at it hard and be like, why is it not just virtue signaling? I'll take that question.
I love it.
But yeah, that's some of the, when we can talk about some of the assurance mechanisms as well. It's like, well, what happens if a forest reburns? Like that is accounted for just like auto and medical health insurance.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Wow. Love it. Well, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me because for the first time ever, I really was able to connect all the dots from big tech company wants to offset, their server farms and all the energy they're spending with carbon offsets. But what are we buying? Oh man, we're paying someone like Droneseed through this huge mechanism to plant a tree or thousands and truly take in that carbon. And I loved connecting those dots there.
I think there's two things on this that I want to touch on. One, Grant, you described this, the financial flywheel. So that in some way was the summarization of the financial flywheel, what's going on. And then number two, carbon recapture on a small scale, Grant, like if let's pretend I'm, like a clean makeup company, like I use clean products and they talk about the carbon emissions that they save or are reducing because you're using their product. You mentioned in a chat, it could only be a feel-good product. What do you mean by that? Is that related to the scale of the carbon being too small?
Well, I guess where I'd like to take that, I think if I'm understanding the question, you clarify for me, is like kind of like, what's the value to the buyer of the offset?
No, more of I'm a company and I claim to, I'm trying to think of a different example. By using my product, you're reducing the amount of carbon if you would have used a similar product that doesn't have this element in it. Is there a too small of an impact? Like if I only save like 100 tons of carbon a year as a product, like by using my product, is that too small of an impact to really make a big dent in what's going on right now with climate change?
I would say that mitigating the worst effects of climate change is not going to be solved by a silver bullet. And so that while all of the impetus of being sustainable should not be put on a consumer, it should be put on our energy and infrastructure and our political systems. I will say that those actions are valuable because they provide funding for, in mass, they provide funding for much greater action in the same way that a GoFundMe for any cause or campaign would from, multiple, couple dollar donations. We'll take, for example, Shopify, one of our buyers. They purchased for themselves, but then they are also utilizing the Planet app, which is an app available on their storefront for all of their merchants to run their commerce through Shopify's payment systems, etc. They'll allow you to, for a couple bucks a month, they'll analyze all your shipping for the month, and they'll say, look, we'll charge you a couple cents per dollar for nature-based solutions, or a couple cents more for nature plus tech, direct air carbon capture, or a couple more cents per dollar for nature plus tech plus frontier, things that don't necessarily have a carbon accounting set up for it yet, but we know we'll need in the future. And on that basis, like those pennies on the dollar in aggregate across all of what Shopify does allow for a much greater impact that funds work like ours to the tune of millions of dollars. And so that's something that I think like those actions are powerful in the same way that any collective group of people doing something. Now, at the same time, is Planet App going to, this is where it gets a little dicey with the marketing, is Planet App going to mitigate all the effects of climate change? Oh, hell no. And so on that basis, like but what can it drive is it can drive decarbonization, it can drive reforesting and locking up more tonnages. It can help us make those transitions. But the largest actions that we can take are through our political infrastructure in changing the rules of where does our energy come from, how are buildings built, etc. Some of those very large areas of energy and finance.
Yeah, great point. Great point. Yeah, it's both micro and macro. It all needs to be happening. You've already jumped into it a bit. Could you tell us the abbreviated story of how Droneseed was started?
Leaving the Maggot company to call back to that.
Love it.
I wanted to do something more that was directly impacting climate, the atmosphere, and I had a bunch of terrible ideas, and we could talk through those. Some of them they're great ideas, but I just wasn't in the place financially, or there was an obvious competitor that would come in and just take me out. And so looking at that, like, kind of work through a number of ideas, and the importance of relationships and connection to other people. It's a hard process. So my heart's out to anybody going through that process of like, how do I make a bigger impact? Grinding through that process was sort of complaining about it to a friend. And as a good friend does, he's like, well, I guess you're going to go plant trees. And having been a part of a very large tree planting project in the northeast of Colombia, I was like, interesting. I wonder what my home country, the United States, does for tree planting, and started to look at that in a really big way. So that's the origin story. And then it's talk to anybody I could get in touch with that was in the industry to figure out what was needed, what were pain points, etc. And then figure out, like, great, what were my initial points of traction? Start to build up a little bit of the tech, start to figure out if I could get some letters of intent from a land manager. That helped us get accepted to Techstars Seattle.
Nice.
We won a competition in Beaverton, Oregon, for a very small check and some office space, and that predated Techstars, and then Techstars, and then we went from there. And so and then it was, well, great, we've got some money to bring on some other people. That's really where we got started.
And is the letter of intent to purchase, like, we will be your customer? That's what that
Yes.
Okay.
That's yeah. Which is, for anybody going through that journey, it's a great proof point. They're usually non-binding, which means that, like, it's not a firm commitment, but we did put it on our letterhead, and it says, yeah, we'd be interested, and usually try and get as many numbers as you can in there, like try and quantify, like, are you going to work with me on a couple 1,000 acres? Is it like, maybe like we do a demo project? Like, is there, like, we'd be willing to spend up to 20K. Like, you try and get some sort of like ballpark in there, and that helps give investors some signal that, yes, you've talked to customers. Customers have been willing to, like, take the time to put it on letterhead and say they're interested, and kind of ballpark
a little bit,
budget what that might look like and how interested, etc. And they can go into full on binding and be a precursor to a larger contract, but that's generally not how they're used in sort of like the early startup days.
Okay, that's very helpful, and we'll talk more about tips, tricks, principles in a little bit. What I love about Droneseed, I heard you said this in a TechCrunch chat, was you guys focus on the actual bio and the software, not on the hardware right now. And that was intentional. You guys use a larger drone that you do have FAA, that's Federal Aviation Administration certification, to do out of line of sight, which is really hard to get, right? They're very strict about that. So that's very cool. Maybe you could tell us more about, is the future of this business in this industry larger drones or electric planes carrying bigger loads and being able to do bigger engagements than the hockey puck, or maybe at a bigger scale? Is that what that looks like?
I wouldn't say that it would be planes per se. I think planes have the biggest advantages. Fixed wing aircraft, whether manned or unmanned, or crewed or uncrewed, their advantages is in survey and being able to do very long distances, or very large distances, very long flight times. Where I would expect this to go is with multi-rotor aircraft. That's where their precision comes in. Fixed wing aircraft, the precision gets a lot more difficult to get to that microsite, which we've identified as very important for the increased survival and establishment, which is, you're playing a numbers game. You want to rig those odds as much as you can. And so the multi-rotors inevitably will get bigger. They will carry heavier payloads. I think the payloads will remain very similar in the sense of, like, about the size of what we do today, that hockey puck. However, where we might see is that there be bigger payloads, longer flight times. And that's something that, if we look at the history of photovoltaics, if we look at the density of batteries. If you look at like there's a technological evolution that occurs where we see like it gets bigger, it gets you start to see the curve there, and we expect that same curve to happen. And just the question is, what's the rate? And so we looked at this and said, we want to use this for a purpose-driven application of the technology. And so we will utilize the best possible systems that are out there, put them together for our purpose-driven application, reforestation, and go from there. And so that's where we got those 3 FAA approvals: the multiple aircraft flown by a single pilot up to 5, heavy lift carrying 57 pounds by an aircraft that's 8 feet in diameter, and then beyond visual line of sight. Like we don't have to be able to see the aircraft. We don't have to be able to see the airspace around it, be able to clear that there are no other aircraft operating within our theater of operations. So those are that's kind of how we've pursued our technological track.
Super interesting. So I love this kind of journey that I'm starting to learn about the reforestation world, and then you guys kind of figuring out your place in it with this early, but you've got these LOIs, you started to get some funding through TechCrunch, and now we've got this problem that you've highlighted a couple times: 7.5 billion acres being burned every year. So what is the business landscape for you right now? I mean, it's hard for me to ask this question because a lot of times it's like you're solving such a huge problem, but this problem is a hard one, which is things are burning down, and then you guys are coming in. But the raw question is, what is the user's appetite? What are you guys finding more customers, which in this case is a little bit, I feel bad that we have these customers that need this, but that we do because of the 7.5 million acres that are being burned every year. What does your customer landscape look like right now? How is the roadmap looking right now?
Yeah, the roadmap's looking, unfortunately, good. I mean, we come in to help communities and land managers that are impacted. We take a look at like New Mexico and the Hermit's Peak and the Pyramid Fire. That's an area where we are looking at, great. We look at what are the 4 things that is needed to reforest, which is there seed? Is there a place to grow it? Greenhouses, because greenhouse space is at a premium because the supply chain is super overwhelmed and there's multi-year backlogs of orders there. And is there a labor supply? And then how do we pay for it all? And so with land managers that are affected there, we've looked at it and there's not a lot of seed. And so organizing collections, same thing we look at Montana, Wyoming, Idaho. We look at some of the areas in Eastern Washington and even some of the areas in some of the like prime, what's been sort of timberlands in Oregon where I'm from. And so we're shoring up the seed supply and collecting there. So we're finding people with deep need for seed and then plug them in and say, great, did you just have a fire or is the fire a couple years old? Because there's a multi-year backlog. Then we can take orders for growing seedlings at Silvaseed. And then if it's a recent fire, deploy the seed vessels and the drones and then pay for it all with carbon offsets or not. So Silvaseed, which we acquired in 2021, wholly owned subsidiary, it collects the seed and organizes the collections and helps those communities impacted by fire in that way and processes them, takes the cones, breaks them apart into not just the cone, gets rid of all the rest of the biomass, just the like viable seed, and utilizes all kinds of technology to make sure like, great, what's the germ test? How viable is that seed? And also grows millions of the seedlings. And then Droneseed takes on how do we get it out to site? Are we using drones? Are we using people? And then paying for it with all the carbon offsets. And so that's the additional piece there. So what we're seeing is that, there's a lot of people coming to us and we can plug them into any one of those 4 things. And they may already have seed. And then great. Well, they deeply need a place to grow it. We're there. They've got seedlings, but they want to do an offset project and need help figuring out how to get it done. We can help with that on the Droneseed side. So those are all of the examples of like, this is what vertically integrated looks like. And we're building a company to do not a couple of carbon offset projects a year, which given what we're able to do and the deep need for the offsets and the lack of offsets in the supply in the market, there's a premium for those. You could do a decent business with 2 to 5 projects a year. We're looking to do reforestation at scale 50, 100, 200 years. This is the challenge that climate change poses for us, which is that we need to go to scale in a very big way and very fast. It's not a build yourself up over 10, 50 years, 100 years. Silvaseed did that. Silvaseed's 130 years old. It's built itself up there. What we're doing now is saying, great, how can we take that same, the same technology that I love that is very overbuilt from the 20s, and then how can we add software to that to make it a very, very big operation? And so that's what we're excited on the seed side. We're excited about on the seedling side as well, utilizing more sophisticated greenhouses.
So I have to ask, is the offsets, are they keeping up with this scale that we need?
For the market? No.
Yeah, they're not.
There's not enough offsets in the system.
Yeah.
You look at the number of companies that have, in Bloomberg NEF, 2 of their 3 scenarios, you see the price spiking really significantly if we're focused on removal-based offsets, which we are. Mm-hmm. And the 3rd scenario is not pretty. The Wall Street Journal noted the same thing, and this was really part of our Series A raise, was we looked at like how many companies had made net zero or carbon negative pledges and how many offsets were in the marketplace on the voluntary side. And we looked at it and we're like, we see single companies that are half to 2/3 of the entire offset market availability. And so if we see that, and these are for the high quality offsets, right? If we see that, then how are all these companies going to go carbon neutral or negative? We don't see the supply. Right. Well, what happened between 2020 and 2021? Offset price doubled, tripled in some cases, and that was because there was a lack of supply and companies were looking to purchase. What we expect to see, and we can get into what the SEC is doing because I'm excited about that. What we expect to see is that companies are going to be purchasing offsets as a hedge, just like they would on oil or steel or interest rates, etc.
Interesting.
And we could see this in the EU market. Ryanair, which is required to purchase compliance credits, which are different than what we do. They purchased a lot of compliance credits as an airline operating in EU in 2020, way more than they needed. And then when the price went up significantly, correlating with what was happening in the rest of the market, they were covered. And analysts gave them a nice hat tip and said, like, look, we think you saved a lot of money this year, 10% in the period. And that was on the CEO's earnings call. And that is something that we expect to see other companies now start to be doing more and more is, okay, we need to be purchasing offsets in advance. The price is going to be going up. The supply isn't there. And that starts to also provide that capital for not just reforestation, because I will pound the desk saying this, trees are not a magic bullet for climate change. They are not a silver bullet. They're not a magic bullet. Like, it is a all hands on deck, and we need all of the possible solutions of decarbonization and electrifying everything, as well as direct air carbon capture, as well as all of the other systems.
Right.
It is an all hands approach. And so like that capital from offsets is what fuels that marketplace and allows those projects to happen, because absent that, who's paying for reforestation, to your earlier question?
Yeah.
Where does the money come from? Well, you have a land manager, they don't have any money. All of their value in the trees just burned up. Wow. The government, it's got a limited amount of money, but that's not measured in percentages of GDP. That's not, and the government generally takes care of the Forest Service land. It's not generally taking care of any private land. Mm-hmm. And the budget for the Forest Service land is woefully inadequate, even with what happened with the Inflation Reduction Act. And there's good progress rate made there, but not nearly enough. So like, where's that money going to come from? We can either just completely surrender and say, well, just let it burn. Gigatons, just let it burn.
Wow.
That seems like a terrible option, especially given that direct air carbon capture very much benefits from nature-based solutions and vice versa. They are low volume, high price. We are higher volume and a much more tolerable price for companies to go negative. You blend the two and you have something that is a very salient product. Is both funding technology we need in the future and funding reforestation that we need now so it can capture carbon over the next 100 years. So like, that, I think like in all of those ways, like there's the offset market is a very valuable aspect in mitigating the worst effects of climate change.
Love it.
Grant, you mentioned earlier, you said we need to go to scale. How do you scale? How does Droneseed scale from here?
I've been searching for the right metaphor, so you guys let me know how I do on this one.
Okay.
But it's a vertically integrated operation. We have to do step 1, seed, and then seedlings and drones, step 2, and then paying for, getting out to site and paying for it all, step 3 and 4. So it's, in some ways, I kind of envision it like a creek kind of flowing downhill, and there's different tide pools here. Each one of those 4 being their own sort of pool, if you will. I've already mixed metaphors with tide pools. Tide pools are not in creeks. But anyway, we'll continue. We'll forge onwards. But basically, how do we scale? Well, step 1, got to very much increase the seed supply. And you can see what we're up to on social. Seed Supply Together, so where we're showing what we're doing. That's our hashtag. It's what we're doing out on site. That is showing how we're organizing collections, what that looks like, what cutting up Doug fir cones looks like, and how we process and things.
Yeah. Nice.
So that's the sort of the first pool. Well, then you have a lot of seed. Well, great. Well, now you can grow a lot more trees. Well, then you need a lot more nursery capacity, or you need a lot more drones. And so that's kind of like the second and third pools. And then you need the labor to either pilot those aircraft or do the tree planting. And then you need the financing to pay for it all. Well, the financing to pay for it all, as we just sort of covered, is where the offsets come in, because otherwise, where is it coming from? And we could talk a little bit about what the offset buyers get as a benefit, because I'm excited about the use cases for our offsets. That's how we scale, as we build up in each one of those 4. So that's why Silvaseed, as an acquisition in 2021, so powerful. We expanded to become the largest private seed bank in the West, and to increase those collections in a really significant way, so that we are the first call for folks looking to do reforestation, because we collect not just for ourselves, but for everybody in the industry, and can also help people find and identify, if we hold a lot of the seed in our storage. So if there's seed, we're a great source for first call on where is it? Do you have any? Can you help me connect with people who do if you don't have it, etc.
Nice.
Seed library.
Yeah.
A little bit like that. Yeah. Ty and I were talking, we're like, what does it take to get to 1 million plus acres? What does it take to get to, if it is a couple million a year? And it seems like it really is just scaling it in terms of units of each of these. So more drones. So say you 10x the drones, more of the carbon offsets. You did mention there's not enough offsets, so that there has to be more creation or granting of offsets. Is that right?
We solve that problem. So when a land manager comes to us and they're like, I want to reforest, we utilize the methodology under Climate Action Reserve, and that gets us a measurable amount of offsets that we'll generate over the next 100 years. And with the easement and nationally accredited land trust, the insurance pool in case there's a reversal or a fire, and the third-party checks of foresters, we're then able to say this is how many tons will be captured in the next 100 years, and then sell those offsets. So companies are able to report on that and say, this is this is how many tons will be captured over the next 100 years. The benefit to companies is that my favorite use cases is in buildings. If you're building buildings, you get paid on both ends. If you are building net zero, you get cheaper lending rates because you're doing a green bond for the construction, because there is a big appetite to see people do more sustainable building. They don't want to see, so they're like, you know what, I still want to profit, but I would shave off a couple bips or a couple, pick your number there in the whatever you're talking about, but they'll lend cheaper rate. And that matters when you're doing, $4, $5, $10, $20 billion construction portfolio over the next half decade. On the other side, you get paid a higher tenant rate, because if you've got companies that are reporting their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, well, they don't want to be reporting the building's incredibly inefficient and it's releasing all this carbon in the atmosphere. And so they'll pay a higher tenant rate to not have that. And so inevitably, to build a net zero building, there's going to be transport of materials. There's going to be emissions. And so what we want to see is more efficient HVAC systems, electrification of everything, low flow water systems, all the things that U.S. Green Building Council, where I work, does, but there are going to be offsets that are going to be needed. And that's where we can help supply that. So that's one of the reasons to purchase offsets. And then companies should be looking at purchasing offsets with a hedge of like a couple of years, because offset prices are not in supply and they're going to go up. And that's in Harvard Business Review.
Now. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's time to buy now and hedge. And that's the thing that the whole finance industry knows how to do. It hedges on lots of things. So like, great. And it just lowers your total cost. The other things that I see that are a benefit to company are what most people are familiar with, which is like, great, like a company is like buying offsets to be net zero so they can claim that in the press. Like, great. I mentioned earlier, like, I'll take that question. Why is it not just straight virtue signaling? They're competing for talent. We compete for talent. Everybody competes for talent. And Apple, Google, Facebook, others in the tech space, very much like
Very
cutthroat.
conscious.
Yeah. And so there are surveys out there that people will take a job for less money if the company is more sustainable. And I'm not sure. I'm not saying they should have to, but I think what it says is that like Apple, others, if they are a more sustainable company, if their job offer is 1-to-1 with a competitor and they're more sustainable, that's more interesting and so they'll have an edge in that. But that same argument applies to consumers as well. And then one of the other things too is like, just from a branding perspective, if you're selling people rocket ships and the future of watches and cars and other things, and you're not talking about climate change, like you're not really selling them a vision of the future that actually meets most people's expectations. And from a branding perspective, you've got to be speaking to that as well. So those are 2 of the 6 like user stories that we sort of see as like, why do people buy offsets? With Shopify as well? Like they're competing with other point of sale companies by being able to offer high quality sourced emissions to allow carbon neutral activities. They're able to distinguish themselves from as a feature. That's a feature in their product, one of many that distinguishes them from why you should use anybody else for point of sale. So I like that as well. And you can see that with credit card companies and all the other payment processors starting to think about like, well, what would that look like? Yeah, and there's some regulatory ones as well that we can dip into. But those are a couple of the user stories that we see as far as why companies are benefiting from doing this and why it makes good financial sense.
Those are helpful. Those are probably the best explanations we've gotten on this.
I totally agree. I think they're the best. And I will just add, I do, like I said at the beginning, I love the idea that I can finally connect the dots. To me, this term carbon offsets was a bit ephemeral, right? A bit esoteric. I didn't know how to like, what does that mean exactly? And I love, and again, just as a user out there, like I love maybe the concept of helping people support companies that do this type of stuff by connecting those dots and having a Droneseed or something like that in the story, in the user story of like, and this is what's happening. Like literally a person or a drone is out there planting a tree because you spent time with this company. And I think that really kind of closes that loop in a lot of ways. So I love it. And I love Droneseed's part of it right now.
I want to pull in the like hardcore techies on this too, because carbon offsets can be kind of like wonky and like, great, sounds like we should do it. Sounds like a fintech thing. Like maybe I'm interested, et cetera, et cetera. Let me frame it in a much broader, bigger vision as well. And I'm going to rub some people the wrong way who are like, spend all the money on Earth. But
go for it. I like it.
If you believe that democracy is a technology, take that as a premise. Paying people in mass to not emit things via the systems that we've sort of described here, be it buildings, recruitment of talent, point of sale, etc. If we were to colonize another planet, and we would need the exact inverse, we would need to pay people on Mars to emit CO2. So a payment, a global system in which people are incentivized financially to either capture carbon or release carbon is a technology like democracy that I think would be very essential for terraformation of another planet. And
interesting.
So for people who are very excited about space, very excited about the future evolution of the trillions of future humans that are going to come onto the planet, and where are they going to go, and how are we going to get resources, et cetera, that let me pull you into that and say that like carbon offsets matters to you in a very deep way because you need this system to be able to terraform a planet and collectivize the action of billions of people. And we need it
Wow.
today to preserve our planet and to be able to preserve the ecosystems and the things
Yep.
that we love, which are just like the basics of a national park. But we can also utilize it as a technology and a much broader vision of the future of where humanity goes as a species. So
Interesting.
now that I've rubbed all the wrong people, rubbed people
Love
the wrong
it,
way,
though.
who are
No,
like,
no.
spend all the money on Earth. I'm like, yes, we should spend the money on Earth, but it will help us in the
Right.
future.
Yeah, there's a give and a take there. I like it. No, there's the yin and the yang. No, you pushed it all the way out there. Well, we usually close this portion with one other related question, though. Now that you've brought us all the way out to space and terraforming other planets, in your mind, when you think about this big, huge problem, what is the next big step change for climate action, climate sustainability?
I very much think of carbon offsets as the way in which human financial systems connect with the same sort of currencies of ecosystems, which are carbon, and how trees communicate in their root structures and share resources, etc. And I kind of picture them as sort of two gears. The human financial system spinning at hundreds of revolutions per minute, and the sort of natural system sort of kind of chugging along at like a couple per minute, right? And like you got to connect those two so that human financial systems are funding the restoration of those natural ecosystems in a way that augments what nature already does. And so I think that to me is really where I see the next step, and how we start to connect those two systems really matters. And there's a lot of different approaches to how we're doing that, and there's been criticism leveled by John Oliver and otherwise. And so I think we're sort of figuring out that, like, okay, great, like we like protecting trees, but like also like intent matters, additionality matters, to use the offset word. And so like reforesting after fire is one of those use cases that's like, great, like this makes sense, it removes carbon and it's additional. So I think that's really where I see things going next. And I think is the like a first step, again, pounding the desk saying trees are not a silver bullet. Well, what does that open up? What's the door that opens up for other climate technology companies, ones that are figuring out how to expand other natural processes to capture carbon, or human processes or otherwise? I think that all of those technologies together collaborate, and the worst thing that we can do is to pick horses and fight about, make them into sports team and fight about whether Boston or New York is the better the better solution. And it should, and I think that like the history of social movements, and our CTO as a LGBTQ plus man would very much like say, look, like a lot of movements, including ones that I have participated in, have benefited from. There's a good faith approach to mitigating a problem, then accept that group into the community and build a coalition. And that's really how,
and make it
in our conversations,
right? Like,
yeah,
then
it's a yes and.
Yeah, exactly. No, I like it. And I love what you said about offsets. I'm obviously focused on this topic this time because you've just connected so many dots for me. But I do feel like this idea of democratizing offsets, right? Like making it almost, my mind immediately went like, if you could make it like a bank transaction fee, where like every time I bought something, there was a little like 1.1% that went to a carbon offset. To me, that feels like a huge step change that we could really power this engine. And I love the gears that you built there, the gears connecting them together in a stronger way. No, that's super good, man. I love all the analogies. You've done a good job, I think, today.
Well, thank you. Well, I guess what I would love to caution people on is that bake sale fee, if you will. I think we're over a couple of decades looking back, where a lot of people hoped that there would be an altruistic endeavor to promote, and that people would take responsibility for their climate footprint. I think like a lot of that fell flat. And so cautioning the entrepreneurs into believing that the sort of like 2 cents at the grocery for a cause would solve the problem. I'm not saying that. I want to distinguish and I want to help any entrepreneur listening to this to like say like the altruism cannot be relied upon, and that has been tried over several decades. And that has been the great hope of many climate companies, that like great, if people will just altruistically donate, like, and everybody did it, we'll solve this problem. It has to make business sense, and it needs to come not from the consumer, but it needs to come from the businesses themselves in the infrastructure. They're either forced to, in some cases, with compliance, as you see with airlines and Ryanair in the EU, or they're getting an advantage with higher tenant rates and lower lending rates, and they're getting they're differentiating themselves from a point of sale perspective, and not there's a carbon neutrality to the shipping, but it's an option, and that makes their product more competitive. That's where that
provides
needs to come from
somewhere else. Yeah, fair.
Altruism will start us down that direction. It might get us. I'm not saying altruism's dead. I'm saying, like, it exists, but it's not to be relied on for a business model. You can only get so far with that altruism.
Like it. All right. I appreciate the distinction.
Let's get into this rapid mayhem question.
Yeah, I think it's time.
All right. So I'm going to ask you the most potent ones here. All right, Grant, are you ready?
Yes.
All right. True or false? 2,000 years ago, 80% of Western Europe was covered by forests. Today, only 43% is covered by forests.
False. I'm more pessimistic than that, unfortunately.
You think less?
I think there's less. Yeah.
You're correct. It's actually 34%, not 43%. Very good. All right. True or false? The Svalbard Global Seed Vault can hold up to 4.5 million seed varieties, yet it currently holds only 1.2.
Ooh. They recently had some troubles. I think they corrected them. We'll see, but I'm going to go optimistic and say true.
You're right. You are
nice.
Correct. All right. Number 3, true or false? In addition to being home to thousands of different trees.
Wait, I think I got that wrong. I thought I was saying the other thing. Anyway, hey, go ahead.
Hey, you said true.
So the Amazon rainforest, home to lots of different trees and animal species. It's also home to 183 indigenous tribes. True or false?
Oh, having lived in Colombia for a number of years, I feel like that number should be higher. Is it higher?
Yes.
Sorry. I was answering in the form of a question, not a true false.
Mr. Trebek, what is? Yes. It's 400 to 500, and about 50 of these tribes have never been in touch with the outside world outside of their own.
Wow.
All right. Last, lightning and humans are two main causes of forest fires. Lightning strikes the earth over 100,000 times a day. That's crazy. 5% of these strikes can cause a fire. True or false?
Don't know about that first question not being but that 5% is what I'm going to focus on. That 5% seems way low. What's that? Hold on. Let me see if I can get this actually into true or false. False. There we go.
Yes. You are correct. It's 10 to 20%.
Nice.
10 to 20%. That's the range. All right. I think you got 100%.
Yeah, definitely.
Smashing job.
Do I get it? Do I get it? Is anybody going to leave a message on my answering machine?
I'm actually going to award you some carbon offsets.
I like it.
Excellent.
Okay. We'll take it.
What I really want is electric tractors. So I'll put that ask out to the universe. Yes. If you're an electric tractor company, please contact us.
John Deere.
Love it.
Product team, you there. I know you hear it. All right, closing this out. Grant, climate change is so big. We've talked about this. People often feel helpless. You mentioned there's not a magic bullet. But what is the equivalent of what a listener can do if they're listening right now? Maybe you could imagine any busy soccer mom or any busy business person.
Vote. It is single-handedly, it is literally how we collectively organize. Literally, that is how we collectively organize, is voting. And I realize that for a lot of people that might seem like a small action, but elections have been decided by, there was a state legislator, there was a literal tie, and they did a coin flip. 2000 was decided by 537 votes in Florida. You can write letters to voters. If you care deeply about climate, the writing letters to voters is one of the, in controlled studies, can increase voter turnout by 1% to 2%, which is massive amounts of votes. Wow. Yeah, the other thing I trumpet often is completely shifting gears is in any movement, I would say mitigating worst effects of climate change is a movement. There is a need for all of the skill sets. Doesn't matter if it's art, doesn't matter if it's accounting. It is not just engineers and software engineers and finance people. The amount of the accounting and otherwise that is needed for carbon finance is high, etc. So there are all kinds of job boards with climate base. There's the climate career portal, especially if you're in oil and gas and you want to transition to geothermal, you want to transition to other things. I would love to brain drain oil and gas. There's a lot of smart people in there that have a lot of valuable skill sets that we can move over. And climate career portal is one that if you search for that, it like targets based off of your oil and gas specialty and like, here's what you could do in climate.
Wow.
And then I got one more if you give me the time, which is, yeah, we at Droneseed we moved our 401k plan to Carbon Collective. Well, first of all, we created a 401k plan because that was new for us. And what it does is it allows people to choose one of three options. They can do traditional electronically traded fund of Vanguard or whatnot, and there's no environmental aspect, or they can do the Vanguard environmental fund, or they can do Carbon Collective. And Carbon Collective is basically it removes all of the oil and gas, because why would you want to invest in what is likely going to be a stranded asset of the future when you could be you could be investing in battery technologies and all these other things. Mm-hmm. And it's a way there is so much money in people's 401ks, and it still does a balanced portfolio of everything. It takes S&P 100, 500, you pick the numbers, whatever. Instead, it just sort of does a much better job than anybody else out there that we've seen as far as targeting that capital to a balanced portfolio for retirement, but with a climate focus. And so that's something that, again, HR professionals who are managing benefits, there's a place for you in mitigating the worst effects of climate change. So,
Love it.
And we'll include the links to all of those in the show notes too for climate career switchers to this industry. This 401k program sounds pretty incredible for companies and HR managers. And then droneseed.com. That's the best place to find and learn about Droneseed.
Yeah, and we'd love people to follow along because we do a lot of education in the space. If what I've said has been interesting and you want to know what does a dug fir look like when it's cut open and where do the seeds look like, that's where we're at. And yeah, if you think followers don't matter, like SpaceX changed the entire contracting process for the federal government utilizing social media because they didn't think it was fair. And a lot of people told other people in Congress that they didn't think it was fair, and NASA got the word. So yeah, it's helpful.
It matters. Follow, and vote.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for everything you're doing. Yeah, I'm really pumped and grateful for what Droneseed is doing. And you're right, we're all, as you said, trees are not the magic bullet, but it's macro and micro changes that we all need to be doing.
And it's a huge one. Really appreciate
Absolutely.
it. Good to
thank you all for spending time with us.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Bye. Ciao. Bye-bye.
Boom. How was that? Well, there's more. So keep listening. We speak with climate tech leaders and change makers in EV, reforestation, solar energy, flood mapping, and a whole lot more. Also, you can give feedback or check out show notes at our website, climatemayhem.com. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.
Oh, don't forget, if you found this valuable or interesting at all, please hit subscribe. That way we know you're loving it. So just go to Spotify or whatever podcast app you're on, hit that subscribe button at the top. Production was done by Daniel Steenkamp with cover art by Harrison Glenn. This is Jacob Kubica with my legendary colleague, Ty Wolf motherfucking Jones. Peace out, Climate Mayhem. Out.